If you're new to Sleep Theories, please consider subscribing. We bring you carefully researched stories that walk the line between history and mystery, designed to engage your mind while helping you unwind. These aren't just tales we've invented, but investigations into the shadows of real history, where truth often proves stranger than any fiction. Tonight's tale is one that will make you question everything you think you know about one of history's darkest chapters. My name is Daniel Roth. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've made my living as an independent journalist specialising in Cold War history. It's not glamorous work. Most people find the subject dry, academic, irrelevant to their daily lives. But I've always been fascinated by secrets, by the stories that governments don't want told, by the documents that get buried in filing cabinets and forgotten for decades. I've written 3 books, contributed to major publications like The Atlantic and Foreign Affairs, and spent countless hours in archives from Moscow to Washington, DC. My first book, Shadows of Yalta, exposed how Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin divided up Eastern Europe in ways that contradicted their public promises. My second, The Berlin Gambit, revealed the secret negotiations that almost prevented German reunification. My third, Red Gold, documented how Soviet intelligence funded Western peace movements during the 1980s. I thought I'd seen every secret the 20th century had to offer. I was wrong. It began on a Tuesday in November 2019, one of those grey Washington days when the sky seems to press down on the city like a lead blanket. I was in the basement of Georgetown University's Lowinger Library, a place I'd visited hundreds of times over the years. The basement archive is a historian's paradise, a nightmare rolled into one. Endless rows of file cabinets, microfilm readers that break down constantly, and fluorescent lights that flicker like strobe lights at a particularly depressing nightclub. I was there researching Soviet intelligence files for my 4th book, a project about post-war espionage networks that I'd been working on for 2 years. The book was meant to explore how quickly the wartime allies became peacetime enemies, how the apparatus of cooperation transformed overnight into machinery of surveillance and sabotage. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, had been working there for 30 years and knew the collection better than anyone. She was a small, efficient woman who spoke in whispers even when we were alone in the basement, as if the documents themselves might overhear our conversations. "I found something that might interest you," she had said that Tuesday morning, leading me to a corner of the archive I'd never explored. We received these microfilm reels in 1995, part of a batch of declassified CIA documents. Most historians have looked through the important material, but there are still boxes that haven't been thoroughly examined. She gestured to a collection of grey metal boxes, each labelled with cryptic alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to me. Mostly bureaucratic correspondence, she warned. Supply requisitions, personnel files, administrative memos, the kind of material that reveals more about how intelligence agencies function day to day than about the big operations everyone writes books about. Perfect, I thought. Sometimes the most revealing truths hide in the most mundane places. History isn't made only in dramatic moments. It's also shaped by thousands of small decisions, routine communications, and bureaucratic processes that leave paper trails. I set up at microfilm reader number 7, the same machine I'd used for years. The thing was ancient, probably installed sometime in the 1980s, and it made a distinctive whirring sound that had become the soundtrack to my research. I loaded the first reel and began the familiar process of scrolling through document after document, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything that might contradict or complicate the established historical narrative. For 2 days I found exactly what Mrs. Chen had promised: routine correspondence, budget requests, staff assignments. Fascinating to someone like me, but hardly earth-shattering. I was beginning to think this would be another dead end when, on the 3rd day, I found it. I was on my 7th reel of the day, scrolling through what appeared to be a collection of memos from various CIA station chiefs to headquarters. Most were routine updates about political developments in their assigned countries. The Paris station chief reported on French Communist Party activities. The London station chief discussed British intelligence cooperation. The Rome station chief detailed Vatican connections to anti-communist movements. Then I came to a memo that made me stop scrolling and lean closer to the screen. CIA Internal Memorandum. Classification Secret. Eyes only. Date March 15th, 1955. From Station Chief, Buenos Aires, to Deputy Director of Operations, Langley. Subject Hitler, Adolf. Possible survival reference previous reports 47B through 52F. Source 17A. Identity protected, deemed highly reliable based on previous operations including paperclip verification and ratline mapping. Reports credible sighting of subject in Bariloche region, Rio Negro province, Argentina. Physical description matches known characteristics. Height approximately 5 feet 8 inches, thin build, greying hair, distinctive moustache. Subject observed February 28, 1955 at remote mountain compound, with small security detail and female companion a matching description of Eva Braun. Source reports subject uses identity Georg Wolf and maintains minimal contact with local population. Compound appears to be supplied by monthly truck convoy from San Carlos de Bariloche. Security measures suggest occupant has significant resources and professional protection. Recommend immediate investigation. Previous reports of subject's death in Berlin bunker increasingly questioned by Soviet sources. Stalin reportedly expressed doubt as early as July 1945, stating, "Hitler is not dead. He escaped either to Spain or Argentina." British intelligence has also noted inconsistencies in Soviet reports regarding recovery and identification of remains. Request authorization for surveillance operation and possible approach to source for additional intelligence. I read the memo 3 times before the words fully registered. Then I read it again and again, searching for any indication that this might be a training exercise, a hypothetical scenario, anything other than what it appeared to be. A serious CIA assessment of the possibility that Adolf Hitler had survived World War II. My hands were shaking as I advanced the microfilm, searching desperately for follow-up reports, investigations, anything that would tell me what happened next. But the trail went cold immediately. The next document in the sequence was a routine memo about grain shipments to Poland, followed by a budget request from the Vienna station. I sat back in that uncomfortable plastic chair staring at the glowing screen, trying to process what I had just discovered. Every historian knows the rumours, the conspiracy theories, the wild claims about Nazi war criminals escaping to South America. Books like The Boys from Brazil and movies like Marathon Man have turned the idea into popular entertainment. But we dismiss these stories as fantasy, as wishful thinking by people who can't accept that evil sometimes simply dies. The historical consensus has been clear for decades. Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on central Berlin. His body was cremated in the Chancellery Garden, and the remains were recovered by Soviet troops. Case closed. But this wasn't some internet forum post or tabloid headlines screaming about Hitler living in Argentina. This was the CIA, 10 years after the war's end, taking seriously the possibility that the most wanted man in human history had somehow escaped justice. I photographed the memo with my phone, then continued searching through the remaining reels, hoping to find more references to the investigation. I found nothing. Either the follow-up reports had been removed from this collection, or they had never been declassified in the first place. As I packed up my materials that evening, Mrs. Chen approached my workstation. "Find anything interesting?" she asked. I hesitated. My first instinct was to share my discovery, to get a second opinion from someone who knew the archive intimately. But something held me back, some instinct that told me this information was dangerous. "Just the usual bureaucratic paperwork," I said. "Nothing that contradicts the standard narrative." Mrs. Chen smiled and nodded, but I caught something in her expression that suggested she didn't entirely believe me. Had she seen the memo before? Did she know what was in those reels? I drove home through the Washington traffic that night with my mind racing. Every historian dreams of discovering something that changes the accepted version of events, some document or piece of evidence that forces us to reconsider what we think we know about the past. But this was bigger than anything I had ever imagined. If the memo was authentic, and if the CIA had taken it seriously enough to launch an investigation, then one of the foundational assumptions of post-war history might be completely false. I thought it was a mistake, a filing error, perhaps even a deliberate piece of disinformation planted to confuse future researchers. Until I began following the paper trail and discovered that the rabbit hole went much deeper than I had ever imagined. The official story of Hitler's death is taught in every history class, repeated in every documentary, carved into the stone of historical fact with the certainty of mathematical truth. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces fought their way through the streets of Berlin, closing in on the Reich Chancellery like a tightening noose, Adolf Hitler retreated to his bunker complex 30 feet beneath the city. There, in a small concrete room that had become the last refuge of the Thousand-Year Reich, he shot himself in the right temple, while Eva Braun, his longtime companion and wife of less than 40 hours, bit down on a cyanide capsule. According to the witnesses who survived to tell the tale, Hitler's bodyguard carried the bodies upstairs to the Chancellery garden, where they were doused with gasoline and burned as Soviet artillery shells exploded around them. The remains were recovered by advancing Soviet troops, identified through dental records, and the chapter was closed forever. Case closed. Evil defeated. Justice served. The monster was dead, and the world could begin to heal. But as I began to dig deeper into the historical record, guided by that single CIA memo that had fallen into my hands like a message from another world, the cracks in the official narrative became impossible to ignore. The first problem was the most obvious. There were no photographs of Hitler's body. In an era when every fallen leader was documented in grisly detail, when the Allies had photographed everything from the liberation of concentration camps to the execution of war criminals, the most wanted man in human history had somehow died without leaving a single image to prove it. I spent the next week at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, pulling every document I could find related to Hitler's final days. The archive is massive, a concrete fortress that houses millions of documents from every period of American history. The World War II collection alone occupies several floors, and I knew from previous research that much of the material related to the war's end remained classified or heavily redacted. But what I could access painted a picture very different from the clean, definitive narrative I had learned in graduate school. A US Army intelligence report from July 1945, just 2 months after Hitler's alleged suicide, noted with bureaucratic understatement, "The circumstances of Hitler's death remain unclear and subject to conflicting accounts. No American or British personnel have been permitted to examine the alleged remains. Soviet claims of positive identification cannot be independently verified." A British MI6 assessment from September 1945 was more direct. While German witnesses confirm Hitler's presence in the bunker complex until April 30th, their accounts of his final hours vary significantly in crucial details. The absence of photographic evidence and the exclusive Soviet control of the alleged remains raises questions about the accepted version of events. The possibility of escape, while unlikely, cannot be entirely discounted. But it was a document I found in the personal papers of Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor, that truly shook my understanding of the historical record. Hopkins had travelled to Moscow in May 1945 for meetings with Stalin about the post-war occupation of Germany. In his private notes from those meetings, Hopkins recorded a conversation that had been excluded from all official transcripts. When Hopkins mentioned Hitler's death as a settled fact, Stalin had reportedly laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the ornate Kremlin conference room. "Hitler is not dead," Stalin had said, according to Hopkins' notes. "The man was a coward who sent millions to die while he cowered in his bunker. Do you think such a man would kill himself when he could run? He escaped, either to Spain or Argentina. Mark my words, we will hear from him again." The implications of Stalin's statement were staggering. Stalin had personally overseen the Soviet advance into Berlin. His troops had captured the bunker, recovered the alleged remains, and provided the dental evidence that supposedly proved Hitler's death. If anyone would know the truth about what happened in those final days, it would be Stalin. So why was he telling Roosevelt's representative that Hitler had escaped? I began reaching out to historians who specialised in Nazi Germany, experts on Soviet intelligence, anyone who might have insights into the final days of the Third Reich. Most were dismissive of my questions. Some were openly hostile, suggesting that I was chasing conspiracy theories that had been thoroughly debunked decades ago. But a few were intrigued enough to share what they knew, and their responses only deepened the mystery. Professor Margaret Thornton at Oxford, one of the world's leading experts on Nazi leadership, told me that she had always been troubled by the inconsistencies in the Soviet account. The Soviets found convenient dental remains, but no other physical evidence, she said during a long-distance phone call. They claimed the bodies had been burned so thoroughly that only teeth survived, yet those teeth were somehow preserved well enough for positive identification. It's possible, but it's also convenient. Dr. Wilhelm Haupt, a German historian who had spent his career studying the Third Reich's final collapse, was even more direct. I have seen documents from Bormann's files that suggest extensive escape preparations, he told me, financial arrangements, false identities, safe houses throughout Europe and South America. The Nazi leadership knew the war was lost by 1943, and they had years to prepare for various contingencies. But it was Dr. Haupt who directed me to the person who would change everything, Arthur Voss. If you want to understand how Nazi war criminals escaped after the war, Dr. Haupt said, you need to talk to the people who were tasked with catching them. Arthur Voss was with US Army intelligence in Austria from 1946 to 1950. He knows more about the rat lines than anyone still alive. I found Voss in a veterans assisted living facility in Bethesda, Maryland, just 20 minutes from downtown Washington. He was 91 years old, confined to a wheelchair by a stroke he'd suffered 5 years earlier, but his mind was still sharp and his memory of his post-war service was remarkably detailed. That's when I learned about Operation Firelight, and everything I thought I knew about the end of World War II began to crumble. Arthur Voss was waiting for me in the facility's common room when I arrived, a small man with pale blue eyes that seemed to hold decades of secrets. Despite his age and physical frailty, there was something about his bearing that suggested he had once been a formidable presence. When he shook my hand, his grip was still firm. Dr. Haupt said you're interested in the rat lines, Voss said without preamble. His voice still carried traces of the Brooklyn accent he'd grown up with, though 7 decades of living in Washington had softened the edges. Most people don't want to hear about that part of the war. They prefer to think we got all the bad guys. We found a quiet corner of the room, away from the television where other residents were watching a game show. Voss positioned his wheelchair so that he could see anyone approaching, a habit that suggested old training died hard. I was stationed in Salzburg from 1946 to 1950, he began, settling into what was clearly a well-rehearsed narrative. Our official mission was denazification, helping to rebuild Austrian institutions without Nazi influence. Our real job was tracking down war criminals who had gone underground when Germany surrendered. He paused to sip from a cup of coffee that had gone cold, then continued. You have to understand, Mr. Roth, that by the time we arrived in Austria, most of the big fish had already disappeared. The Nazi leadership hadn't waited around for the final collapse. They'd been moving people, money and documents out of Germany since 1943, when it became clear that the war couldn't be won. Voss described a systematic operation that was far more sophisticated than I had imagined. The Nazi Party hadn't simply collapsed when Berlin fell. It had transformed itself into a clandestine network dedicated to preserving its leadership and resources for a future resurgence. The operation was called Action Feuerlicht, Operation Firelight, Voss said, leaning forward in his wheelchair. It was Martin Bormann's masterpiece, a comprehensive evacuation plan that covered everything from false identities to financial transfers to safe house networks. They had been planning for defeat longer than most people realised. Bormann, Hitler's deputy and arguably the most powerful man in Nazi Germany during the war's final years, had apparently spent as much time preparing for the Reich's defeat as he had trying to prevent it. Using his control over Nazi Party resources and his network of contacts throughout Europe, he had established escape routes that stretched from Berlin to the remotest corners of South America. The routes were called rat lines, though I don't think that term was used officially, Voss continued. They ran from Germany through Austria, then either north through Switzerland or south through Italy. From there, fugitives could reach Spain, where Franco's government provided protection and onward passage to Argentina. The Spanish connection was crucial, Voss explained. Francisco Franco had remained neutral during the war, but his sympathies had clearly been with the Axis powers. After Germany's defeat, Spain became a crucial way station for fleeing Nazis, offering them protection while they arranged permanent relocation to more distant havens. The Spanish leg of the operation was run by Otto Skorzeny, Voss said. Skorzeny, Hitler's favourite commando, the man who had rescued Mussolini from Allied captivity in a daring raid that had become the stuff of legend. By 1945, Skorzeny was already in Madrid, working with Spanish intelligence to establish the final stage of the pipeline. He had connections throughout the Spanish military and access to ships that could reach South America without attracting attention. I asked Voss how many Nazi fugitives had used these routes. Hundreds, certainly, maybe thousands, he replied. We caught some of them, but usually the small fish. SS officers who had run concentration camps, government officials who had implemented racial policies, scientists who had conducted medical experiments. But the really big names, the ones who had made the crucial decisions, they seemed to vanish into thin air. Voss reached into a folder beside his wheelchair and pulled out a yellowed photograph. It showed a group of men in American military uniforms standing beside a table covered with documents. "That's me in 1948, he said, pointing to a young soldier on the left side of the photograph. We had just raided a safe house in Innsbruck and seized these documents. Financial records, travel permits, letters from Nazi officials who were supposedly dead. The evidence was overwhelming that major war criminals were not only alive but actively communicating with each other." He pointed to the documents spread across the table in the photograph. We found bank account numbers for Swiss accounts, property deeds for ranches in Argentina, even shipping manifests for cargo vessels that had carried more than just commercial goods. The network was vast, well-funded and professionally managed. I asked him the question that had been burning in my mind since I discovered the CIA memo. "Mr. Voss, based on what you learned during your service in Austria, do you think it's possible that Hitler himself could have used one of these rat lines?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Maryland countryside beyond the facility's manicured grounds. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We captured Bormann's personal secretary in the winter of 1948, he said. Else Kruger was her name. She had been hiding in a convent near Munich, protected by nuns who believed they were sheltering a repentant sinner. When we interrogated her, she told us things that weren't included in the official reports." Voss paused again, as if deciding how much to reveal. Kruger claimed that Bormann had arranged for body doubles, decoys who would be found in the bunker, while the real Nazi leadership escaped through prepared routes. She said the Soviets would find bodies all right, but not the right ones. The dental records could be forged, she claimed. They had dentists on their payroll who could create false evidence. The implications of what Voss was suggesting were staggering. If Bormann had indeed arranged for doubles, then the Soviet identification of Hitler's remains might have been based on deliberately falsified evidence. "Did you believe her?" I asked. At the time, no, Voss admitted. It sounded like the desperate fantasy of someone trying to avoid prosecution. But over the years, as we uncovered more evidence of how sophisticated their escape network was, I began to wonder. We found forged documents that were nearly perfect, financial arrangements that had been planned years in advance, safe houses that had been established and supplied before the war even ended. Voss opened his folder again and pulled out a typed document that looked like an intelligence report. "This is a summary of what we found in Austria between 1946 and 1950, he said, handing me the paper. Names, locations, financial transfers, shipping records, everything you'd need to disappear forever and start a new life anywhere in the world. I scanned the document, noting references to Swiss banks, Argentine ranches, and Spanish shipping companies. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. But here's the thing, Voss continued. By 1948, the Cold War was heating up, and our priorities had shifted. We were more interested in recruiting Nazi scientists for the rocket program than hunting Nazi leaders. Operation Paperclip was bringing former SS officers to work for NASA. while Operation Bloodstone was using Nazi intelligence networks to spy on the Soviets. He fixed me with those pale blue eyes, and I saw something that might have been regret. We had the evidence, Mr. Roth. We knew the escape routes, we had captured financial records, we even had testimony from people who had helped organise the evacuations. But the political winds had changed. The German war criminals we were hunting had become potential assets in the new conflict with Russia. Voss died 3 weeks after our interview, succumbing to pneumonia that his weakened immune system couldn't fight. I was one of the last historians to speak with him, and I carried his words with me as I began to follow the trail he had pointed me toward. The trail that led to Spain, and from there to a small resort town in the Argentine Andes, where German immigrants had always been welcome and questions were rarely asked. Madrid in February is a city wrapped in grey wool, cold and damp under skies that seem to press down on the ancient buildings like a weight, but I barely noticed the weather as I made my way through the Spanish capital, following the paper trail that Arthur Voss had described. I had arrived 3 days earlier with a research plan that I hoped would either confirm or dispel my growing suspicions about Hitler's fate. Spain had been the crucial link in the Nazi escape network, the gateway between occupied Europe and the safe havens of South America. If Hitler had indeed escaped through the rat lines, there should be evidence in the Spanish archives. The Spanish National Archives occupy a modern building in the University District, a stark contrast to the medieval and Baroque architecture that dominates central Madrid. But the collection itself reaches back centuries, meticulously preserved records of Spain's role in European and world affairs. I had obtained research credentials through my publisher, claiming to be working on a book about Spanish-Argentine relations in the post-war period. It wasn't entirely false. I was researching Spanish connections to Argentina, just not for the reasons I had stated in my application. The archivist assigned to assist me was a middle-aged woman named Carmen Ruiz, who spoke excellent English and seemed genuinely interested in helping an American historian explore her country's records. She guided me to the relevant collections and explained the filing system with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping confused researchers navigate the bureaucratic maze of historical documentation. The post-war period is well documented, she explained as we walked through this climate-controlled storage areas. Franco's government was very thorough in keeping records, perhaps because they knew they would need to justify their policies to future generations. What I found in those records over the next 5 days was a pattern of German immigration to Argentina that peaked dramatically in the years immediately following the war's end. Most of the immigrants were listed by name, with details about their backgrounds, their reasons for leaving Europe, and their intended destinations in South America. But scattered throughout the immigration records were entries that caught my attention. Transit visa issued to German citizen, identity classification restricted for security purposes, accompanied by 2 associates and 1 female companion, destination Buenos Aires via commercial shipping, February 1946. Special diplomatic consideration granted to German national travelling under protective status. Documentation sealed by order of Ministry of Interior, March 1946. Emergency transit authorization for German citizen requiring immediate departure for health reasons. Details confidential per agreement with Argentine consulate, April 1946. The dates aligned perfectly with Arthur Voss's timeline for the Ratline evacuations. More importantly, the language suggested that Spanish authorities were providing special treatment for certain German immigrants whose identities were being deliberately concealed. I photographed the relevant documents and made careful notes about the reference numbers and filing locations. Then I began cross-referencing the dates with shipping records from Spanish ports, looking for vessels that had departed for Argentina during the same time period. What I found was a pattern of cargo ships and passenger vessels leaving from Spanish ports for Buenos Aires, many of them carrying far more passengers than their manifests indicated. The discrepancies were subtle, the kind of thing that might escape notice unless someone was specifically looking for irregularities. But the most intriguing discovery came on my final day in Madrid. Buried in a collection of correspondence between Spanish and Argentine diplomatic officials, I found a letter dated March 15th, 1946, from the Spanish ambassador in Buenos Aires to the Foreign Ministry in Madrid. The letter, written in formal diplomatic Spanish, reported on the successful arrival of special passengers who had travelled under Spanish protection. The ambassador noted that the passengers had been delivered safely to pre-arranged accommodations in the interior, and that all parties involved expressed satisfaction with the arrangements. The letter was signed by Ambassador Carlos Mendez, and it bore the seal of the Spanish embassy in Buenos Aires. From Madrid, I flew to Buenos Aires, then took a smaller plane to San Carlos de Bariloche, a resort town nestled in the Argentine Andes, about 900 miles southwest of the capital. I had chosen Bariloche for several reasons. It was known for its large German immigrant population. It was isolated enough to provide security for fugitives, and it had appeared in several of the documents I had found in both the CIA archives and the Spanish records. Bariloche turned out to be exactly the kind of place where a German expatriate could disappear without attracting unwanted attention. The town's architecture was distinctly Alpine, with chalet-style buildings and narrow streets that could have been transplanted from Bavaria or Austria. Street signs were in both Spanish and German, and I heard as much German as Spanish spoken in the restaurants and shops. The town had been founded by German immigrants in the early 20th century, and it had maintained its European character even as Argentina underwent dramatic political and social changes. During the 1940s and 1950s, under the presidency of Juan Perón, Argentina had actively encouraged European immigration, offering sanctuary to anyone who could contribute to the country's economic development. I spent my first day in Bariloche's municipal archive, a small building near the town centre that housed records dating back to the community's founding. The archivist, an elderly man named Federico Hoffmann, whose German ancestry was obvious from both his name and his accent, was initially suspicious of my research interests. "Many people come here asking about Germans who came after the war," he said in heavily accented English. "Most are journalists looking for sensational stories, not serious historians." I assured him that my interest was purely academic, that I was researching patterns of post-war immigration throughout South America. Gradually, his suspicions eased, and he began showing me property records, immigration documents and business licenses from the 1940s and 1950s. What I found was evidence of significant German immigration during exactly the period when Arthur Voss had described the Ratline evacuations. Between 1946 and 1950, dozens of German nationals had purchased large, isolated properties in the mountains surrounding Bariloche. Most were described as ranchers or businessmen, but their backgrounds were often vague, and their financial resources seemed disproportionate to their stated occupations. One property record in particular caught my attention. In March 1946, a German national named Georg Wolf had purchased 500 acres of mountain land, about 20 kilometres south of Bariloche. The property included a main residence, several outbuildings, and its own access road. The purchase price, paid in Swiss francs, was substantial enough to suggest that Wolf had significant financial resources. Georg Wolf, the same name that had appeared in the CIA memo I had discovered in Washington. I asked Hoffmann if he remembered anything about the German immigrants from that period. "I was just a boy then," he said, settling into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints no longer worked as they once had. "But I remember that some of the Germans kept to themselves. They would come to town for supplies, but they didn't socialise with the local families. My father said they were probably running from something, but in those days, many people were running from something." On my second day in Bariloche, I began interviewing older residents who might have memories of the post-war German community. Most were polite but unhelpful, claiming no specific recollections of that time period. But on my third day, I met Carlos Mendez, a 73-year-old retired carpenter who had lived in Bariloche his entire life. Mendez was sitting on a bench in the town's central plaza, feeding pigeons from a paper bag when I approached him. When I explained that I was researching German immigration to the region, his weathered face took on a thoughtful expression. "There was one German," he said slowly, as if accessing memories that had been buried for decades. "My father worked construction back then, and sometimes he would take me with him when he had jobs in the mountains. This was 1952, maybe 1953. I was just a boy, but I remembered this man because he scared me." Mendez described a tall, thin German with greying hair and a small moustache, who lived in a stone compound in the mountains south of town. The man spoke little Spanish, but when he did, his accent was distinct from the other German immigrants. He was always with guards, Mendez continued. 2 or 3 men who watched everything, who never seemed to relax. My father said they paid very well for construction work, but they also made it clear that workers were not to ask questions or talk about what they saw. I asked Mendez if he could describe the compound. It was built like a fortress, he said. Stone walls, small windows, everything designed to keep people out. There was also a woman there, blonde, very quiet. And later, there were children. But we never saw them in town. They kept completely to themselves. The description matched perfectly with what I had read in the CIA memo. A remote compound, professional security, a female companion who could have been ever brawn. I asked Mendez if he would be willing to show me the location of the compound. He agreed, but insisted that we take his truck rather than attempting to hike the mountain trails. The road is not maintained anymore, he warned, and the compound has been abandoned for many years, but I think I can still find it. The next morning we set out in Mendez's battered pickup truck, following paved roads out of Bariloche before turning onto a gravel track that wound up into the Andes foothills. The landscape was breathtaking, with snow-capped peaks rising in the distance and pristine lakes reflecting the morning sun. But I was too focused on our destination to appreciate the scenery. After an hour of driving on increasingly rough roads, Mendez stopped the truck and pointed to a barely visible trail leading up the mountainside. "From here, we walk," he said. The hike took another hour, climbing through dense forest that gradually gave way to rocky terrain. Several times I lost sight of any trail at all, but Mendez moved with the confidence of someone who had travelled this route before, even if it had been decades since his last visit. When we finally reached our destination, I understood immediately why someone seeking privacy would have chosen this location. The compound was built into the mountainside in a way that made it nearly invisible from below, and the surrounding terrain would have made any approach easily detectable by guards. The buildings themselves were constructed of local stone, designed to blend with the natural landscape. Time and weather had taken their toll, but the structures remained sound, testament to the quality of their construction. The main building was larger than I had expected, with thick walls and small windows positioned to provide maximum security, while still allowing natural light. Smaller outbuildings surrounded it, connected by covered walkways that would have allowed movement between structures without exposure to surveillance from above. Inside the main building I found the remnants of what had obviously been a comfortable, even luxurious living situation. The rooms had been stripped of furniture and personal belongings, but architectural details remained. Built-in bookshelves, a massive stone fireplace, hardwood floors that had been imported rather than locally sourced. And what had clearly been a study or office, faded rectangles on the walls showed where pictures or maps had once hung. A built-in desk faced a window that offered commanding views of the surrounding mountains and the valley below. But it was in the basement that I made my first real discovery. Hidden behind what appeared to be a wine storage area, I found a section of wall that didn't match the rest of the construction. When I examined it more closely, I realised it was a false wall, probably installed to conceal whatever lay behind it. The wall had been damaged by years of moisture and temperature changes, and I was able to pull away enough of the deteriorated material to reveal a small room beyond. Using the flashlight on my phone, I explored what appeared to have been a private office or document storage area. The walls were covered with maps of South America marked with routes and locations that meant nothing to me, but suggested careful planning and ongoing communication with other sites throughout the continent. Red pins marked locations in Chile, Paraguay, Brazil and other Argentine provinces, connected by lines drawn in what appeared to be red ink. A metal filing cabinet, rusted but intact, sat in the corner of the hidden room. The locks had long since corroded away, and I was able to open the drawers with minimal effort. Inside, I found a treasure trove of documents that made my heart race. Nazi party membership records, some dating back to the 1920s, SS personnel files with photographs and detailed biographical information, financial documents from Swiss banks showing account numbers and transfer records, shipping manifests from vessels that had transported cargo from Europe to South America between 1945 and 1948. But it was in the bottom drawer that I found the item that would change everything I thought I knew about history. Wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked beneath a collection of faded photographs was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. The leather was still supple despite the moisture in the basement, and when I opened it carefully, I found pages covered with handwritten text in German. I should have photographed everything and left the journal where I found it. I should have contacted Argentine authorities, called a university archaeology department, followed proper historical protocol and documented the discovery according to established academic standards. Instead, driven by an excitement I had never experienced in 15 years of historical research, I slipped the journal into my backpack and hiked back down the mountain with Carlos Mendez. That night, in my hotel room in Bariloche, I began the painstaking process of translating the journal entries. My German, while rusty from disuse, was good enough to understand the basic content of what I was reading, and what I was reading made my hands shake so badly that I had to set down my pen several times to steady myself. The journal covered 15 years, from 1946 to 1961, written in the careful handwriting of someone who had been educated in the formal German script of the early 20th century. The early entries were mundane, discussing weather patterns, minor illnesses, and the challenges of adjusting to life in a foreign country. January 15th, 1946. The journey from Spain was difficult, but we have arrived safely at our destination. The compound is well constructed and defensible, though the isolation will take some adjustment. E is handling the transition better than I expected given her delicate constitution. February 3rd, 1946. The local contractors have completed the modifications to the basement areas. The hidden room should provide adequate security for sensitive materials. I have instructed the guards to ensure that no workers return to this area without specific authorization. March 20th, 1946. Received word from B that the evacuation from Europe continues according to plan. The Soviets have apparently found the remains they were seeking, and the deception appears to have succeeded completely. The world believes the wolf is dead. The wolf. I had encountered this codename in other Nazi documents, one of several nicknames that Hitler had used during the war. The reference to B was almost certainly Martin Bormann, who had orchestrated the escape networks that Arthur Voss had described. As I continued reading, a picture emerged of a man living under an assumed identity, constantly worried about discovery, carefully managing a small community of German expatriates who had followed the same escape route to South America. The writer never identified himself by name in the early entries, using only the initials GW, but certain details made his identity increasingly unmistakable. March 15th, 1947. The stomach pains have returned with increased intensity. The same condition that plagued me during the final campaign in Berlin. E insists that I see the specialist in Buenos Aires, but I cannot risk the exposure that such a visit would entail. Perhaps the local doctor can provide adequate treatment without asking too many questions. June 3rd, 1948. Bormann arrived yesterday with disturbing news from our contacts in Europe. The Soviets are claiming they have found my dental remains, and have made positive identification based on the records seized from my personal dentist. At least we know our deception succeeded completely. The world believes the wolf is dead, and our new identities appear to be secure. December 25th, 1950. E gave birth to a daughter this morning. I'd not expected to experience fatherhood at my age, but the child brings me unexpected joy during these long months of isolation. We have decided to call her Ursula, after my sister. She has ES blonde hair and what appear to be my eyes. I stopped reading and stared at that entry for several minutes, trying to process its implications. If this journal was authentic, it meant that not only had Adolf Hitler survived the war and escaped to South America, but he had lived a relatively normal domestic life there. He had had children. The entries continued through the 1950s, describing a quiet routine of reading, correspondence with other German expatriates, and occasional visits from former Nazi officials who had also found refuge in South America. The writer described visits from the doctor, almost certainly Josef Mengele, who had become infamous for his medical experiments at Auschwitz, and the brigadier, likely Klaus Barbie or another high-ranking SS officer. April 12th, 1953. The doctor arrived last week for his annual visit. His work in the local hospitals continues to provide excellent cover for his activities, and he reports that our other associates throughout the continent remain secure in their new identities. We have created a network that could survive indefinitely, provided we maintain our discipline and security protocols. September 8th, 1955. Received word that the Americans have been asking questions in Bariloche about German immigrants from our time period. One of their intelligence officers has been interviewing local residents and examining property records. We have instructed our people in town to provide no information, but this development is concerning. This entry corresponded almost exactly with the date on the CIA memo I had discovered in Washington. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, but it was the final entries from 1960 and 1961 that were most disturbing and provided the most compelling evidence for the journal's authenticity. January 8th, 1960. The Jewish hunters are getting closer to our location. Eichmann's capture in Buenos Aires has terrified everyone in our community. Some are talking of moving deeper into the interior, perhaps to Paraguay or Chile, but I am too old and too sick to begin again. If they come for me, I will not allow myself to be taken alive. That much, at least, I can control. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, had indeed been captured by Israeli agents in Buenos Aires in May 1960. His abduction had sent shockwaves through the Nazi exile community throughout South America, as it demonstrated that their assumed safety was illusory. October 15th, 1960. My health continues to deteriorate. The lung problems that began during the war years have worsened significantly, and I frequently find myself short of breath after minimal exertion. The local doctors cannot provide adequate treatment without comprehensive examinations that would risk exposure. E begs me to seek treatment in Buenos Aires, but the risk is too great, especially with the increased security measures following the Eichmann incident. March 20th, 1961. This may be my final entry. The coughing has become constant, and I can barely hold a pen for more than a few minutes at a time. E and the children will be provided for through the financial arrangements that Bormann established in Switzerland. My work is finished, but the vision remains. The Fourth Reich will rise, not in my lifetime, but in theirs. The flame has not been extinguished, only hidden until the time is right for it to burn again. The final entry was dated April 2nd, 1961, and consisted of only a few lines written in handwriting that was noticeably weaker than the earlier entries. I can no longer write at length, the end approaches, but I die knowing that our cause will survive, that our ideas will find new followers in future generations. The 1,000-year Reich was not defeated, only postponed. The entry was signed with two simple initials, A.H. Adolf Hitler. I sat in that hotel room until dawn, reading and rereading the journal, looking for signs of forgery, for anachronisms or inconsistencies that would reveal it as an elaborate hoax. But everything fit perfectly. The dates corresponded with known historical events, the references aligned with other Nazi documents I had studied, and the handwriting appeared consistent throughout the 15-year span. Most compelling of all was the level of mundane detail that would have been nearly impossible for a forger to fabricate convincingly. The writer described local weather patterns, Argentine political developments, and personal health issues with the kind of specificity that could only come from someone who had actually lived through these experiences. But I knew that no matter how convinced I was of the journal's authenticity, I would need independent verification before I could present my findings to the world. The claims I was prepared to make were too extraordinary to be accepted based solely on my analysis of handwritten documents. That's when I noticed something I had missed during my initial examination of the journal. Caught between pages near the back of the volume were several strands of grey hair, preserved by the leather binding and the dry mountain air of the Argentine Andes. Hair contains DNA, and DNA could provide the proof I needed. Back in Washington, I faced a dilemma that would have challenged any historian. The journal was obviously invaluable as a historical document, but it was also stolen property that I had removed from Argentina without permission. I couldn't publish my findings without independent verification, but seeking that verification would mean admitting to theft. I decided to take a calculated risk that would either validate my discovery or destroy my credibility as a historian. While carefully photographing each page of the journal with high-resolution equipment, I noticed additional details that I had missed during my initial translation in Bariloche. The paper appeared to be of European manufacture, consistent with supplies that might have been brought from Germany in the 1940s. The ink had faded in patterns that suggested genuine aging, and the binding showed wear patterns that would have been difficult to fake convincingly. Most importantly, the hair strands I had discovered were caught in a way that suggested they had accumulated naturally over time, rather than being deliberately placed there by a forger. I carefully extracted the hair strands using tweezers and sealed them in sterile containers. Then I began researching genetic testing laboratories that could perform the analysis I needed without asking too many questions about the source of the sample. Most commercial DNA testing companies required extensive documentation and chain of custody procedures that would have exposed my theft of the journal. But I found a private laboratory in Zurich, Switzerland that specialised in genealogical research and historical investigations. The lab, Genetic Heritage Solutions, was willing to work with anonymous samples provided for academic research purposes. I contacted Dr. Hans Müller, the laboratory's director, and explained that I was researching my family's genealogical history and had discovered hair samples in documents that might have belonged to a distant relative. Dr. Müller assured me that his laboratory could provide accurate results within 4 weeks, and that client confidentiality was their highest priority. I shipped the hair samples to Switzerland using a false name and a commercial mail forwarding service, along with a substantial payment in cash. Then I settled in for what would prove to be the longest month of my professional life. While waiting for the DNA results, I continued my research into the journal's contents, cross-referencing the entries with known historical events and trying to corroborate the writer's claims through independent sources. I found property records in Bariloche that confirmed the purchase of the mountain compound by Georg Wolf in March 1946, exactly as described in the journal. The price paid, listed in both Argentine pesos and Swiss francs, was substantial enough to suggest that Wolf had significant financial resources. Bank records from Switzerland, obtained through a contact at the University of Geneva who specialised in wartime financial crimes, showed regular payments to Wolf's account throughout the 1950s. The payments came from numbered accounts that had been established during the war years, consistent with the journal's references to ongoing financial support from other Nazi fugitives. Most significantly, I found immigration records showing that Gretel Braun, Eva Braun's younger sister, had travelled to Argentina in June 1947. She was listed as visiting family members, but official records showed no Braun relatives in South America. Unless, of course, Eva herself was already living there under an assumed identity. I also discovered that Dr. Josef Mengele had indeed worked in various Argentine hospitals during the 1950s, exactly as described in the journal's references to visits from the doctor. Mengele had used his medical credentials to establish a respectable cover identity, while maintaining contact with other Nazi fugitives throughout South America. When the call finally came from Zurich, I was in my Georgetown apartment, trying to distract myself with other research projects. The phone rang at 3:47 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late April, and Dr. Muller's heavily accented English immediately transported me back to the tension I had been feeling for weeks. "Mr. Roth," he said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone delivering important news, "we have completed the genetic analysis of your sample, and I must say the results are quite remarkable." "Remarkable how?" I asked, gripping the phone so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "The DNA profile shows a clear familial relationship to Paula Hitler, Adolf Hitler's sister, whose genetic information we have on file from previous historical investigations. Our analysis indicates a direct sibling relationship with 99.87% confidence. which is well above the threshold for positive identification. The words hit me like a physical blow. I had hoped for confirmation, but the reality of what Dr. Mueller was telling me was almost impossible to process. "Are you certain about this?" I managed to ask. "Absolutely certain," Dr. Mueller replied. "The genetic markers are unmistakable, and the match is far too close to be explained by any relationship other than direct siblings. The sample also contains markers consistent with Central European ancestry, and the degradation patterns suggest that the hair belonged to a male who died approximately 60 years ago, which aligns perfectly with your estimated timeline." I thanked Dr. Mueller and hung up the phone, then sat in my apartment for the rest of the afternoon, staring at the wall and trying to comprehend what I had just learned. I had proof. Scientific, irrefutable proof that Adolf Hitler had survived World War II, escaped to South America, and lived in Argentina until his death in 1961. The implications were staggering. If Hitler had indeed survived, then one of the foundational assumptions of post-war history was completely false. The Nuremberg trials, the denazification of Germany, the entire process of European reconstruction, had been built on the premise that Nazi leadership had been eliminated or captured. But according to the evidence I had uncovered, the architect of the Holocaust had lived comfortably in exile for 16 years after the world believed him dead. Now I faced the most difficult decision of my career: what to do with this knowledge. My first instinct was to contact major news outlets immediately. This was the story of the century, the revelation that would rewrite history books, vindicate decades of conspiracy theorists who had been dismissed as cranks, and fundamentally change our understanding of how World War II had ended. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was 15 years of experience dealing with sensitive historical materials, or maybe it was the simple paranoia that comes from uncovering secrets that powerful people want to keep buried. Either way, I decided to document everything carefully before going public. I spent the next week organising my evidence, creating multiple copies of all documents, photographs and DNA test results. I uploaded everything to secure cloud storage accounts, mailed copies to colleagues at universities around the world, and prepared a comprehensive report that laid out the entire chain of evidence from the CIA memo to the genetic analysis. I was right to be cautious. The first sign of trouble came 3 days after I'd received the DNA results from Switzerland. I arrived home from the Library of Congress to find that my apartment had been searched with professional thoroughness. Nothing appeared to be missing at first glance, and there were no obvious signs of forced entry, but I could tell immediately that someone had been there. Books were slightly out of place on the shelves, papers in my filing cabinet had been rearranged, and my computer had been moved fractionally from its usual position on my desk. Most telling of all, the dust patterns on my bookshelves had been disturbed in ways that suggested someone had been looking for hidden documents or storage devices. I checked my computer and found that several email messages had been deleted, including my entire correspondence with Dr. Mueller at the Swiss laboratory. When I tried to call the lab to verify our previous conversation, I was told by a receptionist with a different voice that Genetic Heritage Solutions had no record of any sample submitted by a Mr. Roth, and that Dr. Mueller was unavailable for comment. The laboratory had either been compromised or had never existed in the first place. That night, I moved the original journal and all my photocopied materials to a safety deposit box at a bank across town. I also purchased several prepaid cell phones and began using them exclusively for any communications related to my research. The next morning I installed security cameras in my apartment, changed the locks and began varying my daily routine in ways designed to make surveillance more difficult. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. I began to think that I was becoming paranoid, that the break-in had been a simple burglary and the problems with the Swiss laboratory were just administrative confusion. I even started drafting the article that would reveal my findings to the academic world. Then, on a Thursday evening in early May, I was approached outside my apartment building by a man who changed everything. He was about 60 years old, with greying hair and the kind of bearing that suggested military or intelligence background. His suit was expensive but understated, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. When I emerged from the metro station 3 blocks from my apartment, he fell into step beside me, as if we were old friends meeting for dinner. "Mr. Roth," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed friendly but somehow felt like a threat. "I wonder if we might have a conversation." "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" I replied, not taking his offered hand. "Not formally, but I feel as though we've become quite well acquainted through your recent activities. You can call me Mr. Smith, though I suspect you understand that's not my real name." We walked in silence for a block before he spoke again. "You've been asking some very interesting questions lately, Mr. Roth. Questions about events from a very long time ago, people who have been dead for many decades, documents that most historians would consider irrelevant to contemporary scholarship." "I'm a historian," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Asking questions about the past is what I do for a living." "Indeed, and you're quite good at it from what I understand. Your previous books have been well received, and your research methods are impressively thorough. But some questions are better left unasked, and some answers are better left unfound." We had reached the coffee shop on the corner near my apartment building, and Smith gestured toward the entrance. "Would you mind if we continue this conversation inside? I think you'll find what I have to say quite interesting." Against my better judgment, I followed him into the coffee shop. We took a corner table where Smith positioned himself so that he could observe everyone who entered or left the establishment. "You found something in Argentina," he said after ordering black coffee. It wasn't a question. I tried to maintain an expression of neutral curiosity. "I found many things in Argentina: historical documents, property records, immigration files, architectural remains. It's a fascinating country for anyone interested in 20th century European immigration patterns. You found a journal." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I tried not to show any reaction. "I'm not sure what you're referring to." Smith smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Mr. Roth, we both know that's not true. You discovered a leather-bound journal in a hidden room beneath a stone compound approximately 20 kilometres south of Bariloche. The journal contained entries dated from 1946 to 1961, written in German and signed with the initials A.H. You also extracted hair samples from the journal and had them analysed by a private laboratory in Switzerland." My blood turned to ice. The level of detail he possessed about my activities was impossible, unless I had been under constant surveillance. "The DNA analysis confirmed what you suspected," Smith continued, stirring his coffee with mechanical precision. "The hair belonged to Adolf Hitler, providing scientific proof that he had survived the war and lived in Argentina until his death in 1961. I found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" "I represent certain interests that have a stake in maintaining the current historical narrative about the end of World War II. These interests include governments, institutions, and individuals who believe that some truths are too dangerous to be revealed to the general public." Smith reached into his jacket and produced a manila envelope, which he placed on the table between us. "This contains copies of every document you discovered, photographs of the journal entries, and the complete results of the DNA analysis. It also includes surveillance photographs of your activities in Madrid, Buenos Aires, and Bariloche, as well as recordings of your conversations with Arthur Voss and other sources you consulted during your research." He opened the envelope and showed me photographs that made my stomach clench with fear. Pictures of me in the Spanish National Archives, hiking up the mountain trail with Carlos Mendez, examining documents in the hidden room beneath the compound. "The journal you discovered contains information that certain parties would prefer to remain private," Smith continued. "The DNA analysis you commissioned has been noted, archived, and will never be reproduced. Your research has been thorough and impressive, but it ends now." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering you a choice, Mr. Roth. You can continue down this path, attempt to publish your findings, and deal with the considerable consequences that would follow. Or you can accept that some secrets are kept, for very good reasons, and redirect your considerable talents toward other historical projects." Smith reached into the envelope again and produced a cashier's cheque with more zeros than I had ever seen on a single piece of paper. "We're prepared to compensate you generously for your time, your discretion, and your agreement to cease all research related to this topic. The amount should be sufficient to fund any other historical project you might wish to pursue for the remainder of your career." I stared at the check, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. And if I refuse? Smith's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew cold. Then you'll discover that original documents have a way of disappearing, that DNA samples can be contaminated or destroyed, and that witnesses sometimes suffer unfortunate accidents. You'll also find that academic institutions become reluctant to employ historians whose research methods are considered unreliable or whose findings cannot be independently verified. He stood up, left a business card on the table with only a phone number printed on it, and placed a $20 bill beside his untouched coffee. You have 24 hours to decide, Mr. Roth. If you choose to accept our offer, call the number on that card. If you choose to proceed with publication, well, I hope you've made multiple copies of everything, because accidents happen with remarkable frequency to people who possess information that others would prefer to remain hidden. Smith walked out of the coffee shop, leaving me alone with the check, the business card, and the terrifying knowledge that I was in far deeper water than I had ever imagined. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, weighing my options. I could take the money, abandon my research, and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Or I could proceed with publication and risk consequences that Smith had made clear would be severe and possibly fatal. By morning, I had made my decision. At 2:30 that afternoon, someone broke into my safety deposit box using credentials that appeared to be perfectly legitimate. The bank's security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned during the 15 minutes required to remove all of my documents, and the bank manager expressed puzzlement about how anyone could have accessed my box without the proper keys and identification. The journal was gone. The photographs were gone. Even my handwritten notes had been confiscated by people who had the authority to take whatever they wanted and the power to make their actions appear completely legal. But they couldn't take my memory, and they couldn't erase what I had learned. I'm recording this from a location I cannot disclose, using equipment that cannot be traced back to my real identity. The journal is gone, seized by people who never identified themselves, but possessed the authority to take whatever they wanted. The DNA samples have been destroyed or corrupted beyond use. The Swiss laboratory has either been compromised or never existed in the first place. But they couldn't take my memory, and they couldn't erase the knowledge that I spent months acquiring through careful research and investigation. Adolf Hitler did not die in a Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945. That story, repeated in every history textbook and documentary, is a carefully constructed lie that has been maintained for over 75 years by people who believe that some truths are too dangerous for the world to know. Hitler escaped from Berlin through a network of rat lines that had been established years before Germany's defeat. He travelled through Austria and Italy to Spain, where Francisco Franco's government provided protection and passage to Argentina. He lived in a remote mountain compound near Bariloche under the identity of Georg Wolf, protected by a network of Nazi fugitives and sympathisers who had established new lives throughout South America. He was not alone in his exile. Eva Braun accompanied him to Argentina, where they lived as husband and wife under assumed identities. They had children together, a daughter born in 1950, and possibly others whose existence was carefully concealed from the outside world. Hitler lived in comfortable exile for 16 years after the world believed him dead, maintaining contact with other Nazi fugitives, receiving financial support from assets that had been transferred to Switzerland during the war, and apparently believing that his ideas would eventually find new followers who would revive the Nazi movement. He died of natural causes in April 1961, probably from lung disease that had plagued him during his final years. His death went unnoticed by the world, which continued to believe that he had committed suicide in 1945. The official story of Hitler's death was a deliberate fabrication created by the Soviets and accepted by the Western Allies because it provided the closure that everyone needed. Stalin knew the truth, but chose to maintain the deception because it served his political purposes. The dental evidence that supposedly proved Hitler's death was either forged or came from body doubles that had been prepared as part of the Nazi escape plan. For more than 70 years, the world has celebrated Hitler's death as the moment when evil was finally defeated and justice was served. We built our understanding of the post-war world on the assumption that Nazi leadership had been eliminated or brought to justice. But that assumption was wrong. The monster survived, escaped, and lived a quiet life in the mountains while the world celebrated his death. He never faced judgment for the millions of lives he destroyed. He never paid for the Holocaust, the war, or the decades of suffering that followed. Evil doesn't always face justice. Sometimes the worst among us simply fade away into comfortable obscurity, protected by networks of sympathizers and the simple passage of time. They buried bodies that weren't the right bodies. They burned records that told inconvenient truths. They erased names that might have led to uncomfortable questions. They created a narrative that satisfied our need for closure and justice, even though that narrative was built on lies. The people who silenced me believed that maintaining this lie serves a greater good, that revealing the truth would cause more harm than good, reopening wounds that have finally begun to heal. Maybe they're right. Maybe the world is better off believing that Hitler died in 1945, that evil was punished and justice was served. But I can't unknow what I know. I can't unsee what I saw in that mountain compound, can't unfeel the texture of that leather journal, can't forget the scientific precision of the DNA analysis that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that Adolf Hitler survived the war. The wolf lived for 16 years after the world thought he was dead. He had a family, maintained correspondence with other fugitives, and died peacefully in his sleep without ever facing consequences for his crimes. That's the truth they don't want you to know. That's the secret they're willing to kill to protect. The evidence has been destroyed, the witnesses have been silenced, and the official story remains unchanged. But now you know what I know, and that knowledge comes with a responsibility. History is not always what we're told it is. The victors don't just write the history books, they also decide which truths are safe to reveal and which must remain hidden forever. Some monsters never truly die. They just learn to hide better, waiting in the shadows until the world forgets to look for them. The last wolf of the Third Reich is dead now, but his legacy lives on in the networks that protected him, in the institutions that maintained the lie of his death, and possibly in the children he fathered during his years in exile. Evil doesn't end with the death of evil men. It adapts, evolves, and finds new forms. The ideology that led to the Holocaust didn't die in that Berlin bunker in 1945. It survived, protected by people who believed that some ideas are too powerful to die, even when their creators become inconvenient. Sleep well tonight if you can. But remember that not all monsters live in fairy tales, and not all of them stay dead when we think we've killed them. The truth is out there, hidden in archives and protected by people who believe that ignorance is safer than knowledge. But sometimes, if you know where to look and are willing to risk everything to find it, you can uncover secrets that change everything you thought you knew about the world. I found the last wolf. I proved that he survived. And now, despite their best efforts to silence me, you know it too. The summer of 1998 was suffocating in suburban Ohio. 10-year-old Silas Greer lay in his bed, sheets kicked off, staring at the ceiling fan that barely moved the thick air. Sleep was a stranger to him then, had been since he was 7. While other kids his age were dreaming of baseball and bicycles, Silas was discovering the strange world that existed after midnight, when the normal rules seemed suspended and the impossible felt possible. That's how he found Coast to Coast AM. Art Bell's voice was like a beacon in the darkness, smooth and knowing, speaking to the insomniacs and the curious, the believers and the skeptics. Silas had discovered the show 3 months earlier, accidentally, when his father's radio had been left on after a late-night fishing report. Now it was ritual. Every night he'd tune in on his small transistor radio, volume low enough that his parents wouldn't hear, but clear enough that Bell's voice could carry him through the endless dark hours. July 29th, 1998. A Wednesday night that would change everything. Bell was in his element that evening, fielding calls about UFO sightings in Nevada, discussing the latest conspiracy theories about Area 51. Silas had heard it all before. The show had its regular callers, its familiar rhythms. But then Bell's voice took on a different quality, more serious, more intrigued. Folks, I've just received a fax that's, well, it's something else entirely. This comes from someone calling himself John Titor, and he claims to be writing from the year 2036. Silas sat up in bed, suddenly alert. Time travel stories were common on Coast to Coast, but there was something in Bell's tone that suggested this was different. Now, I've read a lot of these over the years, Bell continued, but this one is remarkably detailed, remarkably specific. Let me read it to you. The fax was unlike anything Silas had ever heard. This John Titor person spoke with clinical precision about future events. A civil war that would tear the United States apart by 2005, a mission to retrieve an IBM 5100 computer from 1975, something called the Many Worlds Interpretation of Quantum Mechanics. But what struck Silas most was the voice behind the words. Even filtered through Bell's reading, there was something desperate about it, something urgent. I am a time traveller from the year 2036, Bell read. I'm on my way home after getting an IBM 5100 computer system from the year 1975. My time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit powered by two top-spin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid. The technical jargon washed over Silas, but he grabbed his notebook, the one he kept for recording interesting things he heard on the show, and began sketching. He drew timelines, tried to capture the dates Titor mentioned, the strange sense of inevitability in his words. The Civil War in America will start in 2005, Bell continued reading. By 2015, Russia will launch a nuclear strike against the major cities in the United States, China and Europe. The US cities are destroyed along with the AFE American Federal Empire. The European Union and China will also be destroyed. Oddly enough, Russia is not a target. Silas's pencil moved frantically across the page. Something about this felt different from the usual coast-to-coast fare. This wasn't someone looking for attention or trying to sell a book. This felt like a warning, like a message in a bottle thrown across an ocean of time. But then something strange happened. The broadcast began to experience interference, static that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Through the white noise, Silas could swear he heard another voice, fainter than Bell's but distinct. It sounded like it was saying something, but the words were lost in the electronic snow. Bell paused in his reading. We're having some technical difficulties here, folks. Bear with us. The static continued for nearly 30 seconds, and then cleared as suddenly as it had begun. Bell resumed reading, but Silas noticed something odd. The flow of the text seemed different now, as if something had been skipped over. Well, that's quite a fax, Bell said when he finished. John Titor from 2036. If you're listening, John, give us a call. I'd love to hear more about this time machine of yours. But no call came. The show moved on to other topics, other mysteries. Silas, however, remained fixated on what he had heard. He spent the rest of the night filling his notebook with questions, theories, timelines. There was something about the Titor fax that felt unfinished, as if the static had interrupted something important. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself returning to those notes again and again. He checked the official coast-to-coast archives, but the version posted online seemed shorter than what he remembered hearing. Some of the details felt missing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. The summer ended, school began, and life moved forward. But Silas never forgot that night, never forgot the urgency in those words read by Art Bell's familiar voice. He kept the notebook, even as he grew older, even as the memory began to feel more like a dream than a real experience. He had no way of knowing that 27 years later, he would discover that his childhood memory was more accurate than any official record, and that the missing pieces of that broadcast would lead him into a conspiracy that stretched across decades and possibly across time itself. 2025 arrived with the same quiet desperation that had marked the previous few years. Silas Greer, now 37, and bearing the weight of too many sleepless nights, worked in a building that didn't officially exist. Division Calder occupied 3 floors of a nondescript office complex in McLean, Virginia. hidden beneath the innocuous nameplate of the Federal Data Compliance Agency. His job title was Classified Systems Analyst, which meant he spent his days diving into the digital archaeology of government databases, tracking down corrupted files, fixing network vulnerabilities, and occasionally stumbling across information that reminded him why his security clearance came with a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. The work suited him. It was methodical, solitary, and allowed him to disappear into the intricate puzzles of data systems. Most importantly, it kept his mind occupied during the day, which made the sleepless nights marginally more bearable. On a Tuesday morning in March, Silas was conducting a routine audit of the division's network infrastructure when he noticed something unusual. A relay node in the deepest part of the system was showing signs of corruption, not the usual degradation of old hardware, but something more deliberate. The corruption patterns were too regular, too purposeful. Following the digital breadcrumbs, Silas traced the compromised node to an offline vault he had never seen before. The access path was buried beneath layers of security protocols, and the vault itself was labelled with a designation that made his pulse quicken. Orpheus 99, Titor Incident, Division SP Delta. Titor. The name hit him like a physical blow, dragging him instantly back to that summer night in 1998, to Art Bell's voice reading impossible words from an impossible source. For 27 years that memory had lived in the back of his mind, a strange childhood fixation that he'd never quite been able to shake. His hands trembled slightly as he initiated the access protocols. His clearance level was sufficient, barely, but he had to route through several proxy servers to avoid triggering automatic monitoring systems. Whatever was in this vault, it was meant to stay buried. The files began to populate on his screen, and Silas felt his worldview tilt on its axis. Operation Echo Prism was the primary designation. The associated documents painted a picture that was both impossible and terrifyingly plausible. The files contained logs referencing Temporal Incursion 001, codename TITOR, along with directives marked Retroactive Suppression and Narrative Severance Protocol. But it was the audio file that stopped his heart. The file was labelled Coast to Coast AM 072998 uncut.wav and was significantly larger than any archived version of that broadcast should have been. Silas's hands shook as he downloaded it to a secure partition and opened it in an audio editing program. Art Bell's voice filled his headphones, exactly as he remembered it from that night 27 years ago. The familiar cadence, the careful reading of the tighter facts. But as the broadcast progressed, Silas began to notice discrepancies. The version he was hearing was longer, more detailed. The static that had interrupted the broadcast was there, but it was different, more structured, more purposeful. And then, as the static cleared, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Another voice, faint but distinct, speaking over the interference. Not Art Bell's voice, but something else entirely. The words were distorted, but with some audio manipulation, Silas was able to enhance them. "They found me. I never meant to be here. Don't trust the timeline. It's being rewritten." The voice was desperate, terrified, and it was definitely not part of the original broadcast. Silas sat back in his chair, staring at the waveform on his screen. This was impossible. The file was clearly authentic. The metadata showed it was recorded directly from the Coast to Coast AM broadcast feed. But this enhanced version contained material that had never been publicly archived. He spent the next several hours diving deeper into the ORPHEUS files. What he found painted a picture of a government operation that defied everything he thought he knew about reality. Project Locust Vale appeared to be some sort of information warfare initiative, designed to suppress or alter public perception of specific events. The Titor incident was listed as the final uncollapsed vector in a series of what the files called temporal anomalies. The document suggested that the John Titor who'd sent that fax to Art Bell was not a hoax, not a creative fiction, but something far more dangerous, a genuine disruption to the timeline that had required immediate containment. According to the files, the original broadcast had been intercepted and edited in real time. The version that was archived and distributed publicly had been carefully sanitized, with the most alarming elements removed. The static that Silas remembered was actually the sound of the timeline being corrected, whatever that meant. But perhaps most disturbing of all was a series of voice print analyses comparing the mysterious second voice in the static to various archived recordings. The analysis showed a match to 3 encrypted internal calls, all made from phones within government facilities. One of those calls was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. on July 29th, 1998, the same night as the original broadcast. Silas stared at the screen until his eyes burned. If these files were genuine, then everything he thought he knew about the Titer incident was wrong. The hoax wasn't John Titer's claims about time travel. The hoax was the cover-up, the carefully constructed narrative that had been designed to make the truth look like fiction. He made copies of everything, storing them on encrypted drives and hidden partitions. Something told him that his access to these files wouldn't last long. Whatever Division Calder was really doing, and whatever the truth about John Titer really was, powerful people had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it buried. As he prepared to leave the office that evening, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The familiar paranoia of his profession had taken on a new intensity. He had always known that information was dangerous, but this was different. This felt like he had stumbled across a secret that could rewrite history itself. That night, for the first time in weeks, Silas didn't have trouble sleeping. But his dreams were filled with static, with voices calling across impossible distances, with the growing certainty that the past was not as fixed as he had always believed. The obsession consumed him. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself spending every free moment analysing the Orpheus files, comparing the uncut broadcast with public archives, and trying to piece together a timeline that made any kind of sense. He started with the basics. The original Coast to Coast AM broadcast from July 29th, 1998, was publicly available in multiple archives, but when he compared these versions with the uncut file he'd discovered, the differences were subtle but unmistakable. Entire sections had been removed, not just edited but completely excised from the historical record. The public version of the broadcast ran for exactly 47 minutes and 32 seconds. The uncut version was 51 minutes and 18 seconds long. Nearly 4 minutes of material had been removed, and the editing was so seamless that it was impossible to detect without a direct comparison. But it wasn't just the length that was different. The content itself had been altered. In the public version, Titer's message was presented as an interesting curiosity, a well-crafted piece of science fiction that Bell read with his usual mix of skepticism and entertainment. In the uncut version, Bell's tone was different, more serious, more concerned. There were moments where he paused, as if he was grappling with the implications of what he was reading. "Folks, I have to tell you," Bell said in the uncut version, "this is unlike anything I've ever received. The level of detail, the technical specifications, this doesn't read like someone's creative writing project. This reads like a field report." Those words didn't exist in any public archive. Silas began to dig deeper, tracking down early internet discussions of the Titer incident. He found references to the original broadcast in archived Usenet groups and early web forums, but many of the most detailed discussions had been removed or altered. It was as if someone had gone through the early internet with a fine-toothed comb, systematically removing or modifying any reference to the uncut version of the broadcast. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that the Orpheus files represented a massive information warfare operation. Someone with significant resources and access had gone to extraordinary lengths to alter the historical record of the Titer incident. But why? What was so dangerous about John Titer's message that it required this level of suppression? The answer came when Silas began analysing the metadata embedded in the ORPHEUS files. Hidden within the digital fingerprints of the documents was a wealth of information about their origins and the people who had created them. The files had been compiled by something called the Temporal Anomaly Research Division, which appeared to be a joint operation between the NSA, the CIA, and a private contractor called Meridian Dynamics. The project had been running since 1947, originally focused on what the files called chronological inconsistencies, events that seemed to violate the normal flow of cause and effect. The Taita incident was classified as a Type 7 temporal anomaly, defined as direct communication from an alternate or future timeline. According to the files, the government had been tracking and suppressing temporal anomalies for decades. The Taita incident was significant because it was the first time such an anomaly had occurred in a public forum, broadcast live to millions of listeners across the country. The files contained detailed analysis of Taita's message, breaking down not just the content, but the linguistic patterns, the choice of words, even the rhythm of the sentences. The conclusion was unanimous among the analysts. This was not a hoax. The message showed signs of what they called temporal displacement syndrome, linguistic patterns that suggested the author was experiencing time in a non-linear fashion. But perhaps most disturbing was the section labelled Containment Protocols. The files outlined a comprehensive plan to discredit the Taita incident through a combination of disinformation and narrative manipulation. False information would be seeded into online forums, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims that would make it impossible for anyone to determine what was real and what was fabricated. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when someone calling themselves John Titor began posting on internet forums, the narrative had been so thoroughly corrupted that the real message was lost in a sea of science fiction and hoax claims. Silas spent hours studying the forum posts attributed to John Titor, comparing them with the original facts that had been read on Coast to Coast AM. The differences were striking. The forum posts were elaborate, entertaining, and full of the kind of time travel technobabble that science fiction fans loved. The original facts was terse, technical, and terrifying in its implications. The forum posts were the disinformation campaign. They were designed to turn John Titor into a figure of fun, an internet legend that no one would take seriously. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But who was he? And where had he come from? The answer to that question would lead Silas down a rabbit hole that would shake his understanding of reality itself. The first sign that Silas had attracted unwanted attention came on a Thursday morning in late March. He arrived at his desk to find that his security badge had been downgraded. Not revoked entirely, but his access to certain systems had been restricted. When he tried to access the Orpheus files, he was met with an error message he'd never seen before. Access denied, subject classification under review. His supervisor, a thin man named Carson, who rarely spoke and never smiled, appeared at his cubicle within minutes. Greer, there's been a security audit. Some irregularities in your access patterns. Nothing serious, but you'll need to stick to your assigned projects for the next few weeks while we sort it out. Silas nodded, keeping his expression neutral. Of course, whatever you need. But Carson's eyes lingered on him for a moment too long, and Silas got the distinct impression that this was not a routine security audit. Over the following days, the surveillance became more obvious. His computer would crash at exactly 2:11 a.m. every night, regardless of whether he was using it or not. The crashes were too regular, too precise to be coincidental. Someone was monitoring his system and shutting it down at predetermined intervals. His attempts to communicate with the outside world were also being interfered with. Emails to friends and family would bounce back as undeliverable. His phone calls would drop after exactly 3 minutes. Even his internet searches were being filtered. Certain keywords would return no results, while others would redirect him to innocuous websites. But it was the woman in the slate trench coat who confirmed his worst suspicions. She appeared on Monday morning, standing across the street from his office building. Tall, professional-looking with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. She stood in the same spot for exactly 15 minutes from 8:45 to 9 a.m, then disappeared. The next day she was back, same time, same position. By Friday, Silas had confirmed the pattern. The woman appeared every morning at 8:45 a.m. and every evening at 5:15 p.m. She never looked directly at the building, never made any obvious attempt to observe him, but her presence was too regular to be coincidental. On the following Monday, everything changed. When Silas arrived at his desk, he found a message on his computer terminal. Not an email, not a system notification, but a text file that had been placed directly on his desktop. The file name was simply readme.txt. The message inside was brief. Dr. Lenara Voss, former DoD temporal linguistics analyst, presumed dead in 2016. Titer wasn't a hoax. He wasn't first either. He was the last natural variable. Underground parking garage, level B3 tonight at 11 p.m. Come alone. Bring the files. Silas stared at the message for a long time. Dr. Lenara Voss was a name he recognised from the Orpheus files. She had been one of the lead analysts on the Titer project. According to the documents, she had died in a car accident in 2016, but her analysis of the temporal anomalies had been instrumental in developing the containment protocols. If she was alive, and if she was reaching out to him, then everything was about to change. The rest of the day passed in a blur of paranoia and anticipation. Silas went through the motions of his normal routine, but his mind was racing. He made copies of all the files he'd discovered, storing them on multiple encrypted drives. If this was a trap, he wanted to make sure the information would survive him. At 10:45 p.m, he made his way to the underground parking garage. Level B3 was normally deserted at this hour, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that cast long shadows between the concrete pillars. The place felt like a tomb sealed off from the world above. She was waiting for him near the elevator bank, but she looked nothing like the woman he had seen across the street. This Dr. Lenara Voss was in her 50s, with greying hair and the kind of exhausted look that came from too many years of carrying dangerous secrets. She wore a simple black jacket and jeans, and her eyes never stopped moving, constantly scanning the shadows for threats. "You found the Orpheus files," she said without preamble. "How much do you know?" "I know that the Titer incident was real," Silas replied. "I know that someone went to extraordinary lengths to cover it up, and I know that you're supposed to be dead." She smiled grimly. Death is a relative concept in this business. I've been dead for 9 years, and it's been the safest 9 years of my life. Until now. What do you mean? I mean that someone with access to the Orpheus files has been poking around, asking questions, making copies. That someone is you, and now they know about me too. Silas felt a chill run down his spine. Who are they? The people who have been managing the timeline for the past 70 years. The people who decided that certain events needed to be erased from history. The people who made sure that John Titer became a joke instead of a warning. She gestured for him to follow her deeper into the garage, away from the elevator and the security cameras. When they reached a secluded corner, she turned to face him. "What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible," she said. "But you've already seen the evidence. You know that the official story is a lie. The question is, are you ready to learn the truth?" Silas nodded, though he wasn't sure he was ready for anything. John Titer was real, she continued. He really was a time traveller from the year 2036, but he wasn't the first. There had been others, small incursions, temporal anomalies that we were able to contain and cover up. Titer was different because he went public. He sent that fax to Art Bell, and suddenly millions of people knew about temporal displacement. "But the timeline," Silas said. "If time travel is real, wouldn't his presence in the past have already changed things?" "That's the thing," Voss replied. "The timeline is more resilient than most people think. Small changes get absorbed, corrected by the flow of events. But major disruptions, public knowledge of time travel, that's different. That threatens the stability of the entire temporal framework." "So they killed him?" "They tried to, but Titer was smart. He knew they were coming. That's why he sent the fax to Bell. It was a dead man's switch, a way to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't. But it didn't survive. The broadcast was edited, the story was discredited. That's what they want you to think. But the truth has a way of persisting even when people try to erase it. That's why you found the ORPH-EUS files. That's why you're here now, talking to me." Silas was quiet for a moment, processing what she had told him. What happened to Titer? That's the question, isn't it? According to the official files, he was neutralized. But there are other files, deeper files, that suggest something different. Something that would explain why the timeline has been so unstable lately. What kind of instability? Small things. events that don't quite line up with the historical record, people who remember things differently than they're supposed to, temporal echoes that suggest the past is not as fixed as it should be. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone. This is a temporal resonance detector. It measures fluctuations in the time stream. Watch. She activated the device and the screen filled with a complex waveform. The pattern was chaotic, full of spikes and valleys that seemed to pulse with an organic rhythm. "This is what the timeline looks like now," she said. "Unstable, fractured. Something is wrong with the fundamental structure of causality itself. And you think this is connected to the Titor incident? I think John Titor didn't just travel through time. I think he broke it, and I think the people who are trying to cover it up are making it worse." She handed him the device. "Take this, monitor the readings. If I'm right, if the timeline is continuing to degrade, then we need to do something about it before it's too late." "What can we do?" "We find the truth. We find out what really happened to John Titor, and we figure out how to fix the mess that's been made of history." As if on cue, the lights in the parking garage flickered and went out. In the darkness, Silas could hear the sound of approaching footsteps, multiple sets, moving with military precision. "They found us," Voss whispered. "Run!" The next few days blurred together in a haze of paranoia and digital archaeology. Silas had managed to escape the parking garage that night, but just barely. Dr. Voss had not been so lucky. When he looked for news of her the next morning, there was no trace, no arrest reports, no missing person filings, nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. But she had given him the tools he needed to continue the investigation. The temporal resonance detector confirmed what she had told him. The timeline was becoming increasingly unstable. The readings showed massive fluctuations, temporal distortions that seemed to be growing stronger by the day. More importantly, she had provided him with access codes to deeper levels of the Orpheus archive. Files that painted a picture of a government conspiracy that stretched back decades, involving not just the Titor incident, but a whole series of temporal anomalies that had been systematically covered up. The deeper files revealed the existence of Project Kronos, a black-budget operation that had been running since 1952. The project was tasked with monitoring and suppressing evidence of temporal displacement, but the files suggested that they had gone far beyond simple observation. They were actively manipulating the timeline, making selective alterations to history to maintain what they called narrative stability. According to the files, the Titor incident had been their greatest challenge. Unlike previous temporal anomalies, which had been private or localized, the Titor facts had been broadcast to millions of people. The normal containment protocols wouldn't work. Instead, they had implemented something called Narrative Severance Protocol, a comprehensive disinformation campaign designed to turn truth into fiction. The protocol had 3 phases. First, they would edit the original broadcast, removing the most convincing elements and replacing them with obvious fabrications. Second, they would seed false information into online forums and discussion groups, creating a confusing web of contradictory claims. Third, they would create a false Titor persona, someone who would post elaborate science fiction stories that would completely discredit the original message. The plan had worked perfectly. By 2001, when the fake John Titor began posting on internet forums, the real message had been completely obscured. The public came to know John Titor as an internet legend, a creative hoaxer who had entertained people with elaborate time travel stories. The real John Titor, the one who had sent that desperate fax to Art Bell, had been erased from history. But Silas was beginning to suspect that the story was even more complex than the files suggested. The temporal resonance detector was showing patterns that didn't match the official timeline. There were echoes, repetitions, suggestions that certain events had been repeated or revised multiple times. He decided to take a risk. Using the access codes that Dr. Voss had provided, he began to search for the deepest files in the Kronos archive. What he found made his blood run cold. The files were labelled Ouroboros Protocol, and they contained evidence of something that should have been impossible. The project wasn't just suppressing evidence of time travel. They were engaging in time travel themselves. The files contained detailed logs of temporal operations, missions to specific points in history to make selective alterations. The operations were surgical, precise, designed to change single events without disrupting the larger flow of history. But the cumulative effect was devastating. The timeline had been edited so many times that it was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And at the centre of it all was John Titor. According to the Ouroboros files, he hadn't just travelled back in time once. He had made multiple trips, each time trying to prevent a different catastrophe, each time creating new problems that required additional interventions. The files suggested that Titor wasn't just a time traveller. He was trapped in a temporal loop, endlessly repeating the same mission, never quite achieving the results he was looking for. Each iteration of the loop created new timeline branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. But the most disturbing revelation was contained in the final file labelled Subject Profile, Titor, John, real name classified. The file contained biometric data, voice print analysis, and psychological profiles. But it was the photograph that made Silas's world collapse. The face looking back at him from the screen was older, more weathered, but unmistakably familiar. It was his own face, aged by decades of impossible experience. John Titor was Silas Greer. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. His lifelong insomnia, his fascination with the original broadcast, his ability to access the Orpheus files. He wasn't investigating the Titor incident. He was the Titor incident. The temporal resonance detector in his pocket began to vibrate frantically. The readings were off the charts, suggesting a massive temporal event was about to occur. Around him, reality began to shimmer and distort, as if the fabric of time itself was coming apart. He understood now why the timeline was so unstable. His presence in the past was creating paradoxes, contradictions that the universe was struggling to resolve. Every time he learned more about his own future, he created new branches, new possibilities that had to be managed and contained. The government agents who had been hunting him weren't trying to stop him from revealing the truth. They were trying to prevent him from completing the loop, from becoming the John Titor who would send that fax to Art Bell. But it was too late. The loop was already closing. He could feel it, the pull of destiny, the weight of events that had already been set in motion. In that moment, he understood that he had never had a choice. He had been following a script that had been written decades ago, playing out a role that had been predetermined by the laws of causality itself. His last act was to upload everything he had discovered to a series of encrypted servers hidden in the deep corners of the internet. The files would survive, even if he didn't. Someone else would find them. Someone else would piece together the truth. He typed a final message, his fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had written these same words countless times before. The 5100 was a tool. The broadcast was the ignition. I didn't travel time, I broke it. And now I see everything. The loop was me. As he hit send, the world dissolved around him, reality collapsing into a single point of impossible light. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was his own reflection in the computer screen, but it was different now. Older, wearier, bearing the weight of knowledge that no human mind should have to carry. John Titor was gone. Silas Greer was gone. But the loop continued, as it always had, as it always would. Somewhere in the multiverse, a 10-year-old boy was lying in bed, listening to Art Bell read a fax from a time traveller who claimed to be from the year 2036. The message would always be the same, the warning would always be ignored, and the loop would always close. Time, it seemed, was not a river flowing in one direction. It was a circle, endlessly repeating, endlessly consuming itself. And at the centre of that circle, a voice called out across the years, desperate and urgent and forever unheard. Don't trust the timeline, it's being rewritten. In the end, that was all that remained. The echo of a voice that had been erased from history, the ghost of a man who had tried to change the past, and had only succeeded in ensuring that it would happen exactly as it always had. The Titor files would be discovered eventually, pieced together by someone else who couldn't sleep, someone else who heard voices in the static. The truth would surface, as it always did, but it would be dismissed as fiction, as fantasy, as the delusions of someone who had spent too long staring into the abyss of classified information. And somewhere in the darkness between one moment and the next, between one timeline and another, the loop would continue, eternal and inescapable, a temporal Ouroboros devouring its own tail. The listener had remembered. The listener had become the message, and the message would always be the same.